25 minutes past 8. Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. We turn our attention now to the just concluded World Economic Forum. We're joined in our Abuja studios by Zainab Usman, who is communication consultant for the World Economic Forum in Africa. Thank you for coming on this morning, Zainab. I mean, yes, it's over, but of course, the strategies, the suggestions, the policies that are to be made after this just about to begin, possibly in some cases. But that forum that held in Africa, what is it that you're optimistic about? I mean, have we started seeing decisions or meetings or activities geared towards maximizing what was said at that forum, you think?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. In terms of what I'm most optimistic about, I think it's, first of all, the general theme of the World Economic Forum on Africa Summit itself, which focuses on forging inclusive growth and creating jobs. And at the heart of this is the need for African economies to be transformed. That is the transformation of African economies. And I mean, the whole approach to that is that it is twofold. First, it is macro at the level of governments and institutions and the private sector, and it's also bottom up. That is, it places people at the heart of this transformation agenda for African economies. Well, it is too early to say whether these the outcomes of the summit itself have started to be implemented. It's too early to say that, but we've seen a lot of commitment from the participants of the summit, that is policymakers, civil society, and the private sector. We've seen commitments in terms of healthcare. We've seen commitments in terms of power for Africa, power infrastructure. So, for instance, development partners have pledged to invest $2 billion for power sector reforms in Africa. We've seen commitments in agriculture. We have the Grow Africa initiative, where a lot of the stakeholders have pledged to invest billions of dollars in African economies. We've seen commitments also in education. So one important outcome also was the Safe Schools initiative, which focuses on the northeast part of the country, where there's an insurgency raging on, as we're all aware. So, you know, there are so many of these commitments and initiatives that have come out of the summit that we should really be optimistic about.
Well, did you see enough of the presence of the private sector at that forum to suggest that, yes, we will see them play a major role, be it in agriculture, in the power sector, in financing?
Yes, certainly. I mean, like I said, there's been quite a lot of commitments by the private sector, whether it's the local private sector in Nigeria and in Africa, or the foreign private sector. You know, like I said, for instance, Dangote has pledged to invest about $16 billion in the Nigerian economy, in his petrochemical plant that is coming up. In agriculture, I think he has pledged to invest about $4 billion or so. You know, similarly, other private sector actors as well have all made similar commitments in so many other spheres. But importantly, I mean, for the private sector to be able to redeem these pledges, they also require the government. I mean, when we talk about development, which is what this summit essentially is all about, development of African economies, it's not just going to be private sector driven alone. There needs to be an enabling environment created by the government. The government also has to be an active partner in this, not just by, like I said, creating the enabling environment, but by also having the right institutions, the right regulatory framework, and so on. So it's supposed to be a synergy of sorts between the private sector and the government.
Soon do you think you begin to see action? on both sides. How soon do you think you begin to see action on both sides, private and government?
Well, certainly we should expect action soon, or we should even expect the outcomes of some of the action soon. Because certainly commitments have been made, but also concrete investments have been made as well. So some of these investments will only take, you know, a minimum amount of time to mature. And I guess one example that I can give is the again, going back, and I keep, unfortunately, I keep giving the example of Dangote because he's one such prominent actor, you know, that was not only a co-chair of the World Economic Forum, but is a major investor. And, you know, we're all aware of the investments he has made in the oil sector, in agriculture. We're also aware of investments made by Air Holdings, Transcore in agriculture as well, in Benue with the orange farms and so on. Also in the agriculture sector, other investors, you know, such as Dominion Farms, Dominion Rice, and so on. They've all invested a whole lot of money. So this should, you know, we should see the outcomes of these very, very soon. I really can't put a date to it, but I know there's a lot going on in those sectors.
A lot has been said about, well, you're also a communication consultant to WEFA, but the thing here is that it would seem as if it's just the big players who would benefit. How does the small-time investor, especially the farmers, key into the gains of WEFA?
Yes, that's a very good question, but unfortunately I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question because I do not work for the Agriculture Ministry, for instance. They're in a better position to give a comprehensive response. But for WEFA in general, you know, when you talk about smallholder farmers, or even if you talk about just people at the grassroots in particular, I mean, the whole summit itself has made it very clear that the transformation of Africa would require the participation of people at the grassroots as well. So they're trying to move away from the sort of dominant macro approach that has characterized previous approaches, and they're trying to involve people on the ground as well. So when you look at WEF, there were lots of smaller meetings, side meetings that tried to involve a lot of up-and-coming entrepreneurs. There was also a lot of emphasis on, you know, social entrepreneurship, innovation, and all of that, because the realization is that unless you include ordinary people in the processes of growth, then that growth would end up being very restricted to a small minority of people, a small minority of the population, as we are seeing now. I mean, African countries have grown tremendously in the past decade. Nigeria itself has grown, has recorded economic growth rates of about 7% per annum annually for the past 10, 12 years. But the problem is, and this is what everybody knows, that this growth is not inclusive. This growth has accrued, or the benefits of the growth have accrued to only a small fraction of the population. So for you to have that inclusive growth, you need to involve people as well. And for you to involve people, you need to look at not just large-scale private sector organizations or multinational corporations, but also you have to focus on small-scale enterprises, also smallholder farming in some respects. Innovation and all of that, and for you to be able to include that mass majority of people in the processes of growth, you need to ensure that they have adequate access to education, to healthcare, and there is also sufficient infrastructure. And these are some of the core sectors that a lot of the sessions of the WEF Africa have focused on: healthcare, education, power infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and so on, so as to include the people at the grassroots. So just back to the question, sorry, it seems as if I've digressed a little bit, but just back to that main question of smallholder farmers benefiting. You know, it's with these sorts of initiatives in healthcare and education, in infrastructure, access to financing and so on, that would ensure that they are also able to participate effectively in the growth process.
His Premier was also there, Lee Kishan. He spoke on a number of things, including this $5 billion China-Africa Investment Fund. You know, do you think you've seen some changes, referring to the bureaucratic bottlenecks, to the extent that this fund, the benefits of the fund, will trickle down to the man out there?
Wow, that's quite a tough question, because while yes, there's a link between you know, the bureaucratic processes in Nigeria, in a lot of African countries, and how they're able to access or utilize funds. The other thing is, you know, reforming governmental or public sector institutions to ensure that they are more effective is not really an easy process. It's not just something that will be easily overcome just because funds have been made available through this instrument known as the China-Africa Development Fund. I mean, these are processes of reforms that would take time. They require a lot of political will. And again, this is where it's really paramount that policymakers and governments recognize that really they have a lot of responsibility, because yes, while we're all championing private sector driven growth or driven development, at the same time, really, the governments have to make the environment conducive. And when we talk about enabling environment for business and private sector to thrive, we're talking about these things you mentioned, you know, addressing these bottlenecks, these bureaucratic red tapes and so on. How to register a business is one thing, you know, registering a business or a firm on time without it taking such a long time, you know, ensuring that government institutions have the right capacity. They're able to recruit people that are well qualified, that can execute their tasks effectively. They're able to cut down their sizes and ensure that they are not too bloated or too inefficient. They're able to provide the right remuneration and the right incentives to their staff. These are all the things that would address these bureaucratic bottlenecks. And I'm sure you're aware that these are reforms that would take years, and they would require tremendous amount of political will. Take Nigeria, for instance. You know, a lot of our public sector organizations and parastatals are quite inefficient. They're very bloated. But when you talk about the issue of downsizing to ensure efficiency, it becomes a huge political issue. And of course, people are quite justified in thinking that their livelihoods are going to be taken from them by being retrenched from the public sector. But at the same time, if we want efficiency, these are some of the hard decisions we have to take. So you can see that it's not going to be an easy process at all.
We have to thank you for coming on, Zainab Usman, speaking to us about the gains, the benefits, and what we should be doing to maximize the funds that will be made available, that is already available at the just concluded World Economic Forum. Thank you, Zainab, today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
We're back in just a moment. Join us again.